everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
From a carbon emissions, we don't have any. So nuclear power does not emit carbon dioxide. We also call it clean. So it's clean not only from a carbon dioxide perspective, but it's also clean from nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides, sort of anything that you would get by burning fossil fuels, for example, doesn't happen in nuclear. And in fact, often you talk about the life cycle, if you will. In other words, everything that you have to do from, digging up your uranium or making that solar panel or creating that wind turbine, from the very beginning, sort of all the way through. And nuclear is the lowest from a life cycle carbon perspective. I think there's other things to also look at when you look at all these technologies, rather than just focusing on one thing. I mean, okay, you want, and you've already mentioned a couple, so we want it clean, but you also want it firm. And firm means that you can get it when you need it. Not necessarily if the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, like I need it right now, regardless of whatever the weather is, right? So it's clean, it's firm, low land usage, as we have mentioned before, also low transmission need in terms of getting that energy out, and also really concentrated local benefits. And that means jobs, right? And so if you look at the jobs to operate the plants we have today, or imagine those SMRs, plants that we're going to have tomorrow, a lot of local benefit. And actually, nuclear today really benefits strongly from the local community engagement around our nuclear plants. And I think the last survey that I saw, there's like 83% favorability of nuclear around where nuclear plants are. And I offer that because, that says something really strongly for the people that are next to it and the people that are, understanding it, dealing with it, getting some of the benefits from the taxes and the jobs. There's really strong favorability rating.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Maria Korsnick, Nuclear Energy Institute's president and CEO. Welcome to the show today.
Great. Happy to be here.
So there has been some exciting news around nuclear, and I believe that this could be the next exciting chapter for nuclear energy, especially in the geopolitical context, and it's becoming a central part of the renewable mix. Now, one of the things that I want to share, and I know our audience may or may not know about this, is that we have the first nuclear fusion reactor in nearly 7 years expected to go up in service end of this year or early next year, which is the Unit 3 reactor at Plant Vogtle by Georgia Power. And it's expected to produce some 1,110 megawatts of energy that's going to power some 500,000 homes and businesses.
In fact, it went into operation already, recently.
Recently, yeah.
That's correct.
And then recently also, we've heard that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted the standard design approval application for NuScale's Voyager 6 that's going to have a design for 462 megawatt thermal carbon-free power at the Idaho National Laboratory site. So that's very exciting. And then lastly, on the nuclear fusion research front, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory announced that they achieved net energy gain in nuclear fusion reaction for a second time, and this time with a higher energy yield. Now, of course, we have a long ways to go, but certainly we're heading in the right direction around nuclear fusion. So this kind of gives us a backdrop of some of the exciting things that's happening, but let's just take a step back and give our listeners an opportunity to understand the spectrum of nuclear fusion and then the kinds of nuclear fusion that's both happening on the research front, but also commercialization.
Absolutely. Great. Again, thanks to be here. I've spent over 35 years in the nuclear industry. And so, I'll reflect personally, most of the nuclear that we're familiar with today is called light water reactor technology. And that's what we have here in the United States. We have pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors, but it all deals with water. And what you're hearing about when you think about future nuclear is, yeah, there'll be some that use water as moderation, but there's some that are going to use other things like molten salt. The reactors we use today are called thermal reactors, and so they use a thermal spectrum for neutrons. And the ones that we're thinking of in the future are called fast reactors, and there's a couple different types, but they use a fast neutron spectrum. So what's interesting about it, a bit back to the future, if you think about what we did back in the 1960s, and the US government was looking at lots of different kinds of reactors, we actually had some of these molten salt reactors and some of these fast reactors, high temperature gas reactors back then, but really decided on light water reactor technology largely because that's what the Navy wanted to use. And so as the Navy developed that technology, sort of commercial nuclear also developed around it. It's a beautiful time right now for the nuclear industry. As I said, I've been in for over 35 years, and we've never been at a moment like we are today, with significant innovation really coming now to the marketplace over the next 5 to 10 years. It's an amazing opportunity for us as a nation for what we can do here, but also what we can do to help our allies around the world.
So we're going to hit some of those topics later on, but one of the most important thing is PR. Certainly from a policy and think tank type of organization, I got to imagine the public perception is so important. And I think the last several decades, perhaps maybe not just the US, but as a world, we haven't really done a very good job of properly helping the public to understand the safety and the performance of some of these new generation nuclear fusion energy sources, right?
Well, actually, yeah, I look to nuclear. I often call it the unsung hero. Nuclear has been here, has been performing incredibly well. We have, as the U.S. fleet, a 92% capacity factor, which just means they operate at a very high amount of time as compared to other energy sources, and all clean, carbon-free, no emissions. And so, yes, very much. We've been sort of this operating in the background, doing it incredibly well. And now it's important, I think, for people to appreciate just how important nuclear is in the going forward solution. Really a partnership between nuclear as that foundation, with then some intermittent sources. That can be wind, could be solar, could be batteries. That's a real solid solution. And in fact, there's several different reports, that have been written, but there's really no serious solution as we look ahead that doesn't involve nuclear energy.
So again, just to reiterate, the point is, for those that have this perception, again, it's likely very outdated around safety and contingencies and risk mitigation. What are some of the things that the newest generation are able to do in the case of an emergency?
A lot more passive features in the plants that we're going to see in the future. The plants that we have today are very, very safe. I operated those plants. I was a control room operator earlier in my career. I was responsible for these plants as a chief nuclear officer. I was responsible for 5 reactors in 3 locations. And so very familiar with the different things that we have to do today. Again, very safe. The ones in the future, again, a little bit more passive. And what do I mean by passive? You're counting on things like gravity to act. And we all know that gravity's not going anywhere. And so, things like that are going to be a little bit more built into the systems of the future. And what that means also is just sort of fewer human interactions are needed with the system in order for it to be and maintained in a safe configuration.
So probably the most recent thing that the general public are aware of is the Ukraine invasion. And I think as part of that assault, there was a nuclear plant that was captured by the Russians. What are the kinds of concerns there as we think about both protecting the existing infrastructure, but also as we develop new generation power plants?
Yeah, it's the Zaporizhzhia plant that you're talking about in Ukraine, and it has been taken over by Russians. And it's one of the reasons that the International Atomic Energy Agency, known as IAEA, has, been very engaged in this situation. They have people that are on site even now under the current situation to ensure that things continue to operate safely. And they have eyes on, if you will, so they're not waiting on reports from different places. They're actually seeing it directly for themselves. And so on the good news, the plant has continued, to operate safely. It's a challenging situation, as would any situation be in a war zone. And so it's obviously something that that needs to be monitored, very closely. On the flip side, I would tell you that Ukrainians had been really depending on the operation of this power plant to produce electricity to help their citizens throughout this situation. And so it has, continued to perform well. And our hearts go out to the Ukrainians as they deal with this challenging situation.
So I want to just juxtapose to some of the intermittent clean energy. And again, I think most of us are very much in support of solar, wind, thermal, and nuclear. But it's important to understand some of the limitations. So in the case of wind, especially offshore, particularly I'm talking about the East Coast side on the Atlantic side, is that we are starting to see that the cost overrun is starting to become very exorbitant, and it's starting to have an impact on the ROI of some of these projects. So as a large mega scale project, it's, definitely some of the economics is starting to be kind of softer. On the solar front, while there are certain regions are getting surplus energy from solar, let's say roofs or solar farms, but some parts of the country we're also experiencing where people are having to pay double. They're having to pay the power purchase agreement with those solar installers, and they're still having to pay for their utility because it's not producing enough energy. So we need both, but to your point, fundamentally, they're going to be intermittent. Talk about kind of the compactness and the efficiency of nuclear versus, let's say, taking up acres and acres. And of course, there's all the maintenance with the solar panels as well. And why it's such a critical component, especially in a environment where we have critical energy issues, whether we're talking about natural gas because of Russia, or just potential rise in commodity prices because of what OPEC and Saudi Arabia and others are doing.
Absolutely. And I think you've actually said it very well, when you look at wind and solar, and they're wonderful resources where wind is and where the sun is shining, but they're dispersed resources. So imagine that they're dispersed over a large area, and what that source is trying to do is kind of collect it, whether you're collecting the sunshine or whether you're collecting the wind. On the flip side, nuclear is very concentrated, right? And so rather than being a dispersed energy source, very concentrated energy source. So if I'm showing you the tip of my finger, if we have a fuel pellet that's sort of that size of the tip of my thumb, that's equivalent to, a ton of coal. So I think people can sort of visualize, maybe coal and sort of being carted in and getting into the boiler and producing that energy. So if you can just imagine that amount of concentration, that's what nuclear brings. And so, if you look at, we have 92 reactors in the United States today. Those 92 reactors produce 20%, about 20% of the electricity in the United States. That's pretty amazing, right? 92 things, and you're getting 20% of the nation's energy from that, and almost 50% of the nation's clean energy, okay, from just those 92 places. So, just to give you that appreciation, we put fuel in a core, and that core lasts for, say, 2 years. And so there's a lot of attractiveness to sort of putting that energy, and it's not a pipeline. It's not, sort of a constant feed source, if you will. It's firm, it's reliable, it's clean. It uses relatively small amounts of land for the high volume. So you could get, say, 1,000 megawatts, like the one you're talking about in Georgia, the Vogtle plant that just came online. As a result of getting all that energy in one place, you also need less transmission to get it someplace. If you're that dispersed source, you have to get that transmission from all those places. If you're a concentrated source, you get that one transmission line and you get the benefit of all of that. And so really not wanting to pit nuclear against, these other technologies, I'd reframe it to say, what we really need is that partnership where nuclear provides that foundation. And then we use those dispersed sources when and where they're available.
So, early on, we talked about the Georgia power plant that you just mentioned as well. And that's a good example of delays and cost overruns. And I think aside from the safety aspects, again, from a public relations and image presenting of nuclear energy, is that people have this mindset that, yes, even if nuclear is safer, there's always delays in trying to get these projects up and running, and the cost ends up being 10x of what it was originally estimated. Is that an accurate picture?
So I would say when you don't do something for 30 years and then you do it, you shouldn't expect it's going to be the absolute best. And I would say we prove that. When you don't build for very long periods of time, and that's what we have experienced here in the United States. Let's contrast that to South Korea. South Korea, over the 30 years that the United States was not building any nuclear plants, South Korea was building nuclear plants. And from plant to plant to plant, they got better and better and better. So it really shouldn't surprise us that for these mega projects, what's really good is that when you get good at it, and the only way to get good at it is to do it. And so I think that's really what you're going to see as we look ahead. Vogtle is that large plant that we all are sort of thinking about when we think about nuclear. As you look ahead, yep, there's still going to be those large plants, but there's going to be some medium-sized plants. We call those small modular reactors. There's going to be some small ones. We call those micro reactors, less than, say, 20 megawatts. And so I think as we have more in the portfolio, nuclear can play in different places. If you imagined, well, we need to build something in a desert somewhere. We need to build something in a very far away remote location. So think Alaska or think Canada. You wouldn't think of, well, let me put this 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant there. It's not really well suited for being out in the middle of nowhere. But some of these small modular reactors and these micro reactors, they will be. So on one hand, these innovations are opening up sort of new opportunities and new landscapes. And with having this additional opportunity, we're going to be building more. And the more we build, the better we're going to get.
And I think this discussion around portfolio is critical for a number of reasons, because of the specific use case, as well as CapEx and OpEx, but even from a strategic defense point of view. So you mentioned that nuclear fusion plants are very centralized. So if you have very large power plants and you have just a handful of them across the country, in the case of a war, those are very easy targets, and it really jeopardizes our entire grid system. Whereas if you have medium, we have deployed smaller scale micro, like NuScale Power, for example, then you have distributed and decentralized so that you can't necessarily knock down any one and jeopardize the entire system, for instance. So talk to us about some of the use cases of where some of these different portfolios are suitable and where is it maybe not suitable.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the Department of Defense is very interested in this new version, let's say, of nuclear with this new technology, and especially micro reactors. So again, micro reactors, think of something 20 megawatts or less. They come in a variety of different designs, but they're interested in these to power their bases. And why is that? And you sort of just mentioned it. Well, if you didn't want to even be connected to the grid. Let's say whatever it is that you need to do is really, really important, and you need to do it even if you didn't have a grid, right? Well, that's what these micro reactors can do. They can power that base even if they're not connected to the grid. So it's very, very attractive to the Department of Defense. And, also, I guess, as you mentioned, when you're thinking maybe you have just 90 reactors and those could be targets, they could. These are very hardened resources. And so that's challenging. But think also these resources, they're not counting on, say, pipelines to deliver that product. In that same way, if you look at our grid today and you wanted to, create challenging circumstances, you could just take out a few pipelines, and that would also be very detrimental to a very large, sector for producing power that we have today. So again, the self-containing part of nuclear, I think, is very attractive for the Department of Defense. It's also very attractive to you and me, wherever we live. Think about microgrids, right? Think about having some of the challenging weather that we've seen come through and have the ability to, okay, maybe the rest of the grid's having a challenge, but I could have my microgrid right here, and I have confidence that this has power. That some of the microreactors can be providing that resource. I can tell you, Alaska is very interested. I just came back from Canada recently. There's a lot of mining applications in Canada that are in very far remote locations, and they're very interested in these microreactors. Highly reliable power and very infrequent refueling. For some of these microreactors, when we say infrequent, they would perhaps need to be refueled every 10 years, maybe 10 or 15 years. If you're in a real far away place, that is very attractive, that you don't have to get there too often with a delivery of fuel.
And just a quick comment is, again, this isn't meant to talk about defense and some of the geopolitics that's happening, but South Pacific is a great example. We have distributed islands and man-made islands, and we have to figure out how to actually have defenses in those parts that are completely disconnected. And it doesn't make sense to have solar arrays in a very small mass of land. So these smaller micro nuclear energy sources are super important. Let's talk about carbon emissions. As of today, at the time of recording this interview, the Energy Department announced that they're making one of the biggest investments into carbon capture and carbon removal, direct air capture in particular. So from an oil and gas, there's a lot of efforts. Whether that's being done well, that's a different question. But certainly from the private sector, there's a lot of efforts that's being made in new initiatives, new startups that's coming up to make those things clean. So even if they're processing petrol-based, there's a way to sequester or lock some of those things in. Let's talk about nuclear, about carbon emissions. Is that even relevant? And then after carbon emission, some of the climate activists are going to be thinking, well, maybe it doesn't have the same level of carbon emissions like petrol products, but what about the fuel? What about the radioactivity?
Yeah, well, a lot to unpack there. From a carbon emissions, we don't have any. So nuclear power does not emit carbon dioxide. We also call it clean. So it's clean not only from a carbon dioxide perspective, but it's also clean from nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides, sort of anything that you would get by burning fossil fuels, for example, doesn't happen in nuclear. And in fact, often you talk about the life cycle, if you will. In other words, everything that you have to do from, digging up your uranium or making that solar panel or creating that wind turbine, from the very beginning, sort of all the way through. And nuclear is the lowest from a life cycle carbon perspective. I think there's other things to also look at when you look at all these technologies, rather than just focusing on one thing. I mean, okay, you want, and you've already mentioned a couple, so we want it clean, but you also want it firm. And firm means that you can get it when you need it. Not necessarily if the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, like I need it right now, regardless of whatever the weather is, right? So it's clean, it's firm, low land usage, as we have mentioned before, also low transmission need in terms of getting that energy out, and also really concentrated local benefits. And that means jobs, right? And so if you look at the jobs to operate the plants we have today, or imagine those SMRs, plants that we're going to have tomorrow, a lot of local benefit. And actually, nuclear today really benefits strongly from the local community engagement around our nuclear plants. And I think the last survey that I saw, there's like 83% favorability of nuclear around where nuclear plants are. And I offer that because, that says something really strongly for the people that are next to it and the people that are, understanding it, dealing with it, getting some of the benefits from the taxes and the jobs. There's really strong favorability rating.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Great point. And we're at a very interesting time, and there's lots of different forecasts around our electricity consumption use. So as we get into more electrification and that transition, whether it's on the transportation side to even just distributed grids and solar panels and so forth, is that we're going to need a lot more electricity. And it's not just simply more, but the entire pie is growing as well. So can you talk about the supply potential need or the demand needs? And are we in a position to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to keep up with that?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. There's a variety of forecasts out there, but to your point, all of them talk about the need for more electricity. Our grid is going to be at least needing to be twice what it is today, likely more like 3 or 4 times. And think about things that you hear about. I mean, we hear about, the fact that people need these different, databases, et cetera, and data centers that people need to power. And data centers are important because they need that 724 round the clock power. Well, also think about hearing AI, right? We're all hearing about AI. It's here, it's coming, there's going to be more of it. AI is equally thirsty for energy. So you already had the data centers that want more energy, and now you're going to add AI. And so, when you hear from the Googles and the Microsofts and those folks, they're really, really hungry for that 24/7 clean energy. So there is no question, to your point, the pie is getting bigger. And it's not just getting bigger here in the United States, right? Let's look around the world. The pie is getting bigger everywhere. And people want clean, they want it firm, they want it reliable. And, nuclear checks all of those boxes.
Let's briefly talk about policy and regulatory frameworks, as well as the current political climate, specifically in Congress, from a legislative perspective. We have never been so bipartisan in history. And so when it comes to clean energy, where are we, and how supportive is just the, Congress overall? And what are the specific things that's being done from your institution level, NEI, in particularly supporting some of these policy initiatives?
Yeah, well, we're one of the few things I feel like people can agree on here in Washington, D.C. is nuclear power. And so we get support from the right and we get support from the left on nuclear. And perhaps we get it for different reasons, but we get it. And you can really see the fingerprints on that from the last few years. There was the bipartisan infrastructure package that we are all familiar with, happened within the last 2 years, and there was strong support for nuclear in that. There was over $2 billion for advanced reactor development projects. There was $6 billion for what was called a civil nuclear credit program to support the current fleet. And then more recently in the Inflation Reduction Act, you saw tax credits. And for the longest time, we have really been pushing to get nuclear on an even playing field. Wind would get tax credits or solar would get tax credits but nuclear, not so much. And so what we really wanted was, let's just call them clean tax credits, and anybody that's clean can get them. And so you saw in that Inflation Reduction Act just that. They're called clean. And if you can prove that you're clean, then you can get these tax credits. And so really a very exciting time for all that can produce clean, but I'll say nuclear specifically because we were included now in that conversation. And so lots of very positive signals, I would say, across the board in Congress. And there's been several other, bills related to nuclear, and that's at the federal level. But let's take a step back. The federal level is good, needed, necessary. Well, let's talk about the state level. So if 5 or 6 years ago, there was even 10 bills that had anything to do with nuclear around the state legislatures, that would have been a big deal. For the first 6 or 7 months of this year, 200 bills have been introduced in state legislatures across the U.S. having to do with nuclear. So I'm just trying to give you some data points in terms of, there has really been a sea change in the conversation around commercial nuclear power. And The support is coming for a variety of reasons. Some people are looking at it from a climate perspective. Some people are looking at it from an energy security perspective. Some people look at it from a national security perspective. Some people look at it from a jobs perspective. But, again, across the board. And so, again, our challenge is we have this innovation pipeline is just sort of full of new ideas that are kind of coming to the fore. They've got to get through the regulatory process. So we need to make sure that that regulatory process is greased and ready to receive and efficiently review the stuff that's coming through. And then we've got to get to build, right? We talked before, you don't build often, you're not really good at it. We have got to get to build and show from that first one to the second one, to the third one, to the fourth one, we're expecting a 30 to 40% improvement in build and cost. And that was reflected recently in a Department of Energy report called the Liftoff Report for Advanced Reactors.
This is very exciting, really is. And I'm very excited. I mean, this is truly a new era for nuclear. So I'm very hopeful. And I think there's a lot of things that's happening, certainly the IRA. And then if you look at the southern states with a lot of the new industries that's cropping up, that's supporting the solar industry, battery industry, manufacturing industry. The Midwest, you have a lot of automation, robotics, and manufacturing. And then other things like you talked about, energy security. You got Texas, you got California that are constantly having brownouts, real drain and, antiquated infrastructure that's really challenged, and that's putting people's lives in danger. So it's really critical, and I think a lot of things are pointing in the right direction. For my last question, looking a little bit more forward, two fronts. Briefly, if you can talk about it. So China is probably, clearly our greatest Cold War nemesis at this point, and they are really building up their arsenal in terms of naval power. Whether it's naval ships, whether it's submarines, they're not quite at the caliber that the U.S. is. But the next generation U.S. submarines are going to definitely have to need nuclear energy, right? So talk a little bit about that. And then on the space front, the Space Force, for example, there's a lot of private commercialization that's happening, but also we want to make sure that as private entities and commercial interests go up into the moon, the Mars, not only do we want to make sure we protect those interests, but we also have our interests in mind from a defense perspective. And certainly when we think about the dark side of the moon and places where it doesn't get sufficient solar energy, nuclear becomes a must-have. Any comments here?
Yeah, great. Well, from a China perspective, I can just share both China and Russia are very interested in commercial nuclear energy. And they're interested in not only building it in their own country. I think China's building about 20 reactors today, but they're also interested in building it in other people's countries and controlling their energy supply. And so I go back to, why does the United States need to be relevant and up to speed, if you will, on sort of what's going on with commercial nuclear? Because we not only need to build it here, we need to build it for our allies. And when you build a reactor in somebody else's country, it's a 100-year relationship. I mean, think about that. You're going to build it, you're going to operate it for 60, 80 years, maybe even longer. You're going to decommission it. So there is a geopolitical connection with these countries when you are helping and supporting them as they build commercial nuclear. And Russia and China know that. And so they are very much interested in sort of getting their foot in the ground. They've just recently built in Egypt. They've just recently built in Turkey, as an example. And so the unfortunate, war in Ukraine, I think, has really woken up a lot of people to say, wait a minute, it does matter who you do business with. And people that perhaps thought that they were going to move forward and do business with either China or Russia, they're thinking again. So this is a really very unique opportunity for U.S. technology, U.S. leadership to demonstrate all that we bring to the market, really help our allies. As you mentioned, it's a very critical time.
And then any final comments about the Space Force?
Oh, well, I think it's just sort of a natural. When I talked about the fact that you get a lot of energy from a very small amount of source, just think about sending anything to space. Weight matters, volume matters. And so I think nuclear is a natural.
All right. So with that, I have been joined by Maria Korsnick, NEI's president and CEO. Thank you for joining today.
Great. Thanks. Good to talk to you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.